Hey everybody, this is Commissioner Cook back with you again for our third video, which is going to be on draft and the draft strategy. So, if you haven't yet voted on when you want your draft date to be, right now it's between Saturday morning at 9 a.m. and Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening at 7 p.m. And if you're watching this video after we've already decided, well, I'm sorry, it's too late. So go on to your fantasy football website and vote for your choice of draft times. So, we're going to do a snake draft, a little dyslexic, this year, just like we did last year. So you're going to have 1 through 8 going, and then 8 through 1 is going to go again. And your draft slots are going to be completely randomized, just like last year. There's nothing I can do about it, there's nothing you can do about it. ESPN does it, they're going to completely randomize our slots, and there's no trading slots. So you get what you get, and you kind of have to work your strategy around what you got. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 4 basic points on draft strategy and some things to think about when we go into the draft. I'm going to give you 4 more specific things to look for when choosing players to help you out in balancing your team and looking for good spots on your team. Now remember, this is just only advice, stuff that I've learned over the years, it's stuff that ESPN talks about, stuff that different fantasy football expert websites talk about. But in the end, this is your game. This is for fun, so if there's players that you want that don't match up with this strategy type stuff, go ahead and get them. It's for fun, it's your deal, do what you want. So this is just to help you guys understand what might be good strategically from what other people might be saying, okay? So the first point is about quarterbacks. Quarterback strategy, when you look at quarterbacks, there's only 1 slot for the quarterback slot. If you look at running backs and wide receivers, you have 2.5 because we have a split slot. So 2.5 slots for running backs and wide receivers each. So what that means is that for your quarterbacks, you're only going to have 8 teams each with 1 quarterback. So that's 8 starting quarterbacks within the entire league. Where running backs, you're going to have 20 running backs and 20 wide receivers starting within the league, which make running backs and wide receivers much higher demand, which is why we see running backs listed at the very top rather than quarterbacks. And it's based on supply and demand. So, when looking at the very beginning of the draft, a lot of experts always choose filling up your running backs and maybe a wide receiver slot if you have the opportunity to pick up like a Calvin Johnson or a really strong wide receiver you know is going to be big points every week because they're in higher demand and you only have 8 starting quarterbacks. Second, with your tight ends this year, tight ends tend to be in the past, one of those slots where you only have a handful of good tight ends in the league, like your Dallas Clark, your Antonio Gates, your Tony Gonzalez, and beyond that, you didn't really have much depth within the league on good tight ends. This year, it's different. There are a lot of good tight ends in the league, which in fantasy football, it means that slot, you can maybe wait a little longer on that. So a lot of experts are saying, hey, you don't need to jump early to fill that slot. You can wait until the 8th or 9th round, or maybe even later, to pick up a good tight end. So that's something to take into consideration as well, given whatever slot you're in, what you're needing on your team. Something to think about. There are a lot of good tight ends in the league this year. Third, when it comes to defenses and kickers, they're really a crapshoot. There's a lot of luck involved, and it really depends on who they're playing more than who they actually are. Now, of course, having a good, solid defense like the Steelers that we all love, like the Ravens who we all hate, they're still good to have because they're going to be more consistent throughout the year. But at the same time, there's 2 major points with defenses is that it depends a lot on who they're playing, on how well they perform. And second, they're really easy to pick up a good defense in your waivers and in your free agency list. And a lot of times you can pick them up based on the matchups that they're playing against. If you're playing against a really bad team, you can pick up that defense in free agency list and put them in for that week and rotate them out. So that's a good strategy with defenses. There's a lot of players to look to. And instead of trying to use an earlier draft pick, they'll just wait till the very end just to pick someone up. Same thing with kickers. It's really hard to gauge a good kicker. Of course, you can go for a Janikowski, and they're going to be more consistent. They're going to give you consistency on those long field goals. But again, how much they actually get to kick has nothing to do with them. And fourth, something to remember when analyzing who you're going to pick, last year is not this year. Looking at last year's stats is not always good to rely on. Look at Chris Johnson. Amazing year in 2009. Terrible year in 2010. You can't base all of your choices on what happened last year. You got to look at it and look at what teams they're with, who they have around them this year, and make your decisions off of what's going on this year. Very different Peyton Manning this year than 2 years ago. Very different Colts this year than 2 years ago, than last year. Who knows what's going to happen this year? It's hard to tell. So when looking at your choices, don't base everything fully off of what happened last year, okay? All right, now I've got some 4 tips, more detailed tips to look at when choosing your players, especially later on in the draft, because there's a lot of things that are very obvious. You know, you're going through your draft in the first couple of rounds. You get Adrian Peterson, you pick up Adrian Peterson. You get Calvin Johnson, you pick up Calvin Johnson. You get, Aaron Rodgers, you pick up Aaron Rodgers. It's not brain science. Now, when it gets down to the later drafts, some things to think about, though, are maybe one, looking at backups for running backs that tend to be injury prone. Lots of running backs go out early in the season. Week 5, week 6, you might have an Adrian Peterson like last year, going out and being out for 6 weeks or 8 weeks. Looking at, last year his backup running back came in and he scored massive fantasy points for them. So looking at injury prone backups, especially to wide receivers. 2, looking at players this year, especially with all the changes, who have inherited a number 1 slot. Especially with wide receivers that got changed around a lot, looking at players who are now the number 1 receiver on their team. They tend to be higher in the fantasy totals because they get those receptions, because they get those long passes. Looking at a Vincent Jackson who just went to the Bucs. He's their new number 1 slot receiver there. Things to look for. 3rd, players that finished strong last year that might not have been, your top players are going to be in the top, 8 picks or 9 picks, but names that you might know from the end of last season who have really finished strong and they're going to be starting this year because they finished strong last year, they tend to do really well too. So think about the end of last year, maybe the last 6 weeks or 4 weeks of the season last year, and who really did well ending the season. And then 4th, make sure you have a fairly balanced roster. It tends to help in the long run, not putting all of your eggs in one basket. So as you're going through the draft, make sure you're pretty balanced between the strength that you have in your running backs, the strengths that you have in your wide receivers, because you only have so many spots for starting players. So if you have 4 really good running backs, you're only going to be able to play 3 of them. Or if you have 3 good running backs and 3 good wide receivers, one of them is going to have to sit out. So making sure that you have a good, well-balanced roster while you're making your picks is going to help you in the long run. So, these are all just advice, tips that I've seen and used in the last several years playing fantasy football. If you're interested in more deep analytical type stuff, it's all out there online. Just Google fantasy football tips, fantasy football advice, draft pick stuff, and see what you find. And you'll find a lot of this stuff. You might find stuff that's different than this. But in the end, it's all about having fun, and if you want to do whatever you want, just have fun, alright? So I hope this little instructional video helps you guys, and if you have any questions, shoot me an email, shoot me a Facebook message, give me a call, and we'll talk more about it, alright? Cool. You guys have a good draft, and I'll see you next weekend.